Okay, commissioners, we are live on YouTube, so we are good to go.
All right, welcome to North Logan City Planning and Zoning Committee meeting, April 10th, 2025. We will begin with a prayer by Gavin and a pledge by Nat. I guess we can do a pledge first. Please join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice.
Dear Heavenly Father, we are grateful for this opportunity we have to meet and discuss the business of the city today. We give you gratitude for this beautiful valley, a place that we live, for the peace, freedom, for the kindness and goodness of our neighbors around us. Father, we give you gratitude for the good people who are our neighbors. Help us tonight to make wise decisions, ones that are based on the law and ones that protect the rights and freedom of those that we give you gratitude for these things.
Amen. Thank you, Gavin. We need a motion to adopt the agenda. Make that motion, please.
Second?
Okay, Teresa moved and Gavin seconded the motion to approve the agenda. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. We also need a motion to approve the minutes of April 10th, Planning and Zoning Commission meeting. Motion. Anyone want to make a motion? I read them. They look good to me. Okay, Teresa made a motion. Second it.
Second.
Okay, Porter seconded it. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, the minutes are approved. Let's move on to any follow-up issues from our previous meetings. Scott?
Okay, our last meeting on March 20th, it's been a minute since that meeting. We've been talking about our text amendments to Title 12 and all of the land use adjustments we've been making. We're going to continue that discussion today. No action is being taken as a reminder on that until we get through the rest of the sections of code that need to be updated for the general plan. So we discussed that last meeting. We also discussed a conditional use permit for a short-term rental at 2856 North 1000 East. That conditional use permit was issued, and we're waiting for the business license to be inspected for that use. But that's the only follow-up from our last meeting.
All right, thank you, Scott. Let's move on to item number 1. Scott, do you want to explain this to us before we start our public hearing?
Yeah, let me hop into the staff report here real quick. This item is for, this is a review and recommendation for a preliminary plat and a subdivision improvement plan for a 2-lot commercial subdivision out on 2042 North, 200 West in the commercial general zone. The reason why this is a recommendation to the city council is because it is a commercial subdivision. And to just clarify, when it's residential, those types of subdivisions have to be reviewed and approved by planning commission. That was a recent state code change, but because this is commercial, we do have the ability to send that on to city council. So your action on this is administrative in nature, but it's recommendation to city council, just to clarify the action on this particular topic. I'm going to also open up the exhibit so that we can just look at the proposed subdivision. To give some context where this is located, Main Street is located approximately where my cursor is. This parcel to the south is the local GMC Chevrolet Murdoch dealership. There's a vacant parcel here, also in Logan City, and this boundary line here is the boundary between Logan and North Logan. So this is one of the first parcels on 2nd West in the North Logan boundary. It's again a 2-lot subdivision for this particular parcel. Total, we're looking at 10 acres, but the 2 lots you'll see are configured in a way a little bit non-standard. We have an access stem coming back to lot number 1, and that was done intentionally. With lot number 2, a little bit more square in nature for future development. This came to the Planning Commission beginning way back in 2001. Initially, when there were some discussions about potential self-storage project. And just to provide a little bit of history here, back in 2001, self-storage in the zoning ordinance was a conditionally permitted use. And so the applicant started looking into obtaining that conditional use permit, which the Planning Commission did grant the conditional use permit. That conditional use permit was active, but a year went by without any physical changes to the property, and so the city wondered if it would be expired. And so we issued a notice of expiration. The property owner said, hey, we have been working on engineering behind the scenes. We'd like an opportunity to extend that original approval. So that discussion was held. The Planning Commission did extend the permit with a very specific timeline for action towards project completion. And essentially what needs to happen is this project needs to move forward and a building permit needs to be issued by late in the summer this year. So they're working towards that goal. And the first step is to prepare the property with the subdivision plat, create the parcel that the storage units will occupy, which again is lot number 1. And once platted, they can work through what's called a design review process, which is essentially a review of their site plan, making sure their buildings fit within setbacks, they have landscaping and those types of things. But what we wanted to do with this lot number 1 is we wanted to make sure, because it is kind of an awkward configuration, that the layout of the buildings would fit with turning radiuses for emergency vehicles and where the stormwater was going to go, because it relies on lot number 2 to satisfy some of those requirements. So as we work with the developer, our fire marshal, we look at turning radiuses, where the buildings will be located a little bit earlier on than we normally would. Typically, we don't look at that when we're just subdividing land, creating individual lots, but we wanted to make sure things would fit before we finalized a plat. So that's being done behind the scenes with our development review committee, which is an administrative review of staff members. So as we are looking at this now, again, this is a preliminary plat and a subdivision improvement plan. So we're looking at water, sewer, stormwater, secondary water, and all of those items are required to be submitted for the DRC to review. And as it was reviewed, the DRC does have a positive recommendation. They are the recommending body to the Planning Commission, and then the Planning Commission then recommends it up to the City Council. So there's a positive recommendation. As part of this project, there's right-of-way dedication on 2nd West, frontage improvements, so big gutter, asphalt, sidewalk to the full city standard. So that's part of the project here. There's also a little bit of a tie-in between Auto Mall Drive, 1950 North, and where this parcel begins is a little bit of an asphalt tie-in that is part of those improvement plans, just to bring that little bit of access up to the standard. Again, it's in Logan City, so it's kind of out of our purview. But what we anticipate, again, the storage units will take this rear portion and then reserve the frontage on 2nd West for lot 2. One of the things we wanted to make sure was that we preserve commercial capacity, because Second West is going to be a fairly substantial road in the future. It will connect further up north to 2500 North. And we foresee quite a bit more traffic and more commercial viability in the future, perhaps not today, where it's kind of landlocked and facing away from existing Main Street, but we foresee there being a commercial opportunity on Lot 2. So we worked with the developer to configure it to where those storage units are kind of tucked in between commercial, where it's a little bit less of a need on prime frontage. So there are a couple of findings in the staff report, but I'm happy to answer any questions you guys might have for this project. Oh, I should also mention, we do have a representative from the developer. Kent is in the audience if we have any questions for him.
Any questions, Gavin?
Just a quick one. I don't see on the plat the width of the pole of the flag lot. It looks about 60. Is that?
Let's zoom in, and we can also open up the improvement plans and maybe a dimension in there as well. Looks like it's 65 plus another.
I'm looking at the
Over here.
looking at a different. Good. All right. So that's sufficient for two-way traffic of trucks and potentially pulling trailers.
Yeah, we actually had the developer submit an exhibit with turning radiuses that we had our fire marshal review to make sure there was adequate turning radius for that same concern.
Good. Any other questions? All right, we'll open the public hearing. Public hearing for the Storage Down subdivision. And here are the instructions for a public hearing. Before you begin, please state your name for the record. Speak into the microphone so your comments can be recorded. Please limit your statements to 3 minutes. You're not allowed to combine or bank minutes to speak on behalf of others. Please phrase your opinions in the form of statements, not questions. A public hearing is your opportunity to express your opinions to the City Council, not a time to ask questions of or to expect dialogue between yourself and the council or city staff. Please address your comments to the commission, not to the public. The commission might ask questions about your comments in order for them to better understand you. In the future, note that if you have questions or need to discuss an issue, you may meet with the city council members or the appropriate city staff member before the public hearing where dialogue can take place. You may provide a written statement as your input for a hearing. You may read your entire statement or summarize it. The 3-minute limit still applies. You may provide a copy of the written statement to the city recorder. He will make copies for the city council, and the written statement will become a part of the public record. However, the written submitted statement will not be included in minutes of the meeting. All right, we'll open our public hearing now. Anybody would like to comment? All right, we'll close our public hearing now. Commission, to talk about anything? Any questions? We've had questions. No. Any questions?
I like the concept of having the storage in the back and preserving that prime frontage on the road. So it looks like a good proposal to me.
And I like I don't have a copy of the staff had good comments on it.
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead, Jeff.
I move that we forward a positive recommendation for the plat and improvement plans for file number sub 2024-05, and based on the facts finding identified in the staff report.
All right, it's been moved. And second,
I'll second.
Gavin moved and Porter second that we send on a positive recommendation to the city council for the Storage Down subdivision. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, great. Moving on to item number 2. Mahogany Ridge Phase 5 and 6 Amendment and Public Utility Easement Vacation. Scott, tell us about that.
This particular project is a plat amendment with a public utility easement vacation. So the reason why it's a plat amendment is because it's an existing subdivision. There's a couple of lots. They're split between phase 5 and phase 6 of the Mahogany Ridge subdivision. So it's lot 36, 65. They just happen to be at different phases, but they're immediately adjacent to each other. Both owned by the same property owner, and this property owner is looking to combine them to just improve his siting of a building footprint, like the center building on that, those two lots that he owns. It's located again in Canyon Ridge. There's two addresses. One's on a corner and one's on Canyon Ridge Drive. So it's 3512 Pinion Circle and 1882 Sundancer Loop. Total acreage, 1.32 acres. Each of those two is about an acre. I think I might have done my math wrong. So about a half acre piece. So it's 1.03 acres between the two of them. RE1 zoning. And what I'd like to show you here is this exhibit, which I have to kind of parse these together because they're on two separate subdivision plats. You'll see phase 5 on the left and then phase 6 here on the right, and they come together between these two lots. So here's the side property line in question that the property owner would like to essentially erase and just merge them into a single building lot, single parcel ID number. But I'm going to zoom in here. When subdivisions are platted, we dedicate around the perimeter of each lot what's called a public utility easement, and those are depicted with dashed lines or perimeter of the property, and those are reserved for utility companies to provide their utility and service to each lot owner in a subdivision. And they're broadly applied, so any public utility can use them if needed for their services. Typically, though, most utilities are in the front yard. Not always, but for the most part they are. Secondary water usually is in the backyard. And some utilities are in the street itself, so water, sewer, out in the street. Sometimes we have cable, private utilities in those public utility easements with power and gas and those types of things. So this exhibit down below shows where we know existing infrastructure to be located. So green is sewer, blue is water. Here's your water or your sewer meters. Sorry, water meters here. Here's your stub for your fire hydrant in between the two lots. So we don't have any public utilities in the easement here. And the private utilities are going to be in the front yard. Now, state code does require that when we are vacating easements that we issue notice to any potentially affected entity. So we send it to all the public utility providers. So we send a notice to Rock Power, Dominion Energy, or Enbridge now. And we send it to any known cable companies that might have cable or fiber as those potentially affected entities. We would also send a notice to any adjacent property owners if they were directly serviceable by those public utility easements. But as you'll see in this plat here, there's only one property owner that is within the vicinity of the easements being requested for vacation. And this property has its own public utility along the side property. So if any utility needed to provide access through this area, there's adequate utility easement available there. So we're looking at just merging the two in the plat amendment, but the easement vacation we're looking at, is there any impacts that may need to be. Now, when we issue those notices to those potentially affected entities, they can write in and say, hey, actually, we need those easements. We have facilities planned for perhaps installed in those easements. And they can appeal and say, hey, we would prefer you not vacate that easement with whatever master plan or capital plan they may have. But ultimately, it's up to the city council to decide whether or not anyone is needing that easement. State code also has a very specific set of findings that we need to make. One is that good cause exists for the vacation, and number two, neither the public interest nor a person will be materially injured by the vacation, which I feel like in this circumstance is easy to make those findings. So also what's unique about this, because it's the plat amendment with easement vacation, the recommending body to the city council, the legislative authority, the city council has to be the one to formally approve of an easement vacation. So again, in this situation, normally you would be the one authority to approve a plat amendment. but because it is on vacation, it does need to go to city council. Okay, do you guys have any questions about what is being requested and the process it needs to take?
This isn't really a question, but I found this really interesting because my husband and I did this in another city.
Yeah.
And it did go through, and it was a big headache. And so I kept thinking, what can we do to make this not a big headache for these people? It just makes sense to pick a lot and be able to do a different house. So
Yeah.
I was very supportive of it.
It seemed pretty straightforward to me. Any other comments?
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. So I've seen in the past that being different phases of a plat, 2 lots in different phases on the lap line, is that an issue? Is that some challenges?
It would be, so if they were doing just a lot line adjustment, that would be a challenge. State code requires that whenever we are changing the number of lots in the subdivision, we have to go through plat amendment. So you can't just do a boundary line adjustment between 2. You could if you own 2 lots in the same subdivision itself, but because they're between 2 phases, you have to do a plat amendment, which essentially is a new plat. You're drawing a boundary, as you can see here, you're drawing a new boundary around both of those lots. If you're calling it just a new, you could name it anything you wanted technically, but it's still subject to the CCNRs of the original development, so it's not like you're expunging that HOA oversight, but it's essentially just saying that they can't just adjust the lines as 2 different government documents that would be quoted at different points in time.
I see the distinction between a lot like that. So that makes sense. The other thing I'm curious about is that in the staff report, section B, I'm probably carrying out something. Number 5 says public hearing.
Good catch. So a public hearing is required, but it will be done with the city council.
City council. Got it.
Yeah, that's right.
So this is not the public hearing portion of that. This is a recommendation to city council. City council will have that hearing.
And state code it's interesting. If you're amending a plat and you are the sole owner of all the land being amended, requested for amendment, you don't have to do a public hearing because you're amending your property and no one else's. If you're amending a plat that there's other property owners involved, you would have to notify them. They would actually have to be joint participants in the application itself and a signer on the plat that is being amended if their property is invoked in that amendment request. But in this situation, the property owner owns both lots and he's not moving his boundaries outward or adjusting or vacating any right of way that another property owner in the subdivision may have a percentage claim to use. So, yeah, but there will be a public hearing with city council because of the easement vacation.
Got it. Thanks for educating me.
Yeah.
Thanks, Porter. Gavin?
I was just going to let people know if you did want to speak on this topic, if you're listening online or here in the audience, that you get a chance at the city council.
That's right. And I would anticipate if we get a positive recommendation from Planning Commission tonight, this would be on the next city council agenda, which is next month. Get a date here. It would be on the 14th of May.
Okay, I think we're ready to make a positive recommendation, correct? All right, I guess we have to decide that.
Did you make the motion?
I'm not going to make the motion. Somebody make a motion. I was just moving this along.
I move that we forward a positive recommendation regarding the proposed plat amendment and associated public utility easement vacations, along with the 2 findings of fact in the staff report.
All right, it's been amended
I'll second that.
and amended by Gavin, seconded by Teresa. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, thank you. I like the word vacation. I have to think about that for a minute.
Be more exciting.
That's right. Okay, let's move on to item number 3. Newman Daycare expansion, review and action regarding a conditional use permit to have 16 children from 8 up to 16. Scott, you want to tell us this?
Yeah, we've looked at one of these somewhat in the recent past where home-based daycare is looking to expand from what is permitted under business license with 8 children up to 16 with a conditional use permit. The property located at 2566 North, 370 East is requesting that conditional use permit. They have worked with the state to go through the state licensing that is needed to increase their capacity. And so now they need to work with us, the land use authority, on the conditional use permit for local permissibility. So this, let me scroll down to some images here. So the property is located just a little bit west of the city offices. Here's the city library in this exhibit, and the city office is just off screen. So it's fronting on 370 East, and a little bit closer of a snapshot here. The applicant had submitted the narrative as to just to describe what it is they're looking to do and how they want to manage, pick up and drop off and those types of things. And they obviously recognize they live on a U-shaped street network, their accessibility to their street, and anticipate using those streets to gain access to their property. One of the things we're always concerned about when we go from 8 children up to 16 is just the pick up and drop off. Obviously, there's some safety that's involved, and we mitigate that with state licensing, but also inspections of the property by our fire marshal and our building official, and our police as well through the business licensing side of things. But we want to make sure pick up drop off is adequate. And as you recall, the last one we reviewed was actually denied because of access. This is a little bit of a different scenario because they do have access on a public street system that meets our street standard. So there's no concern with emergency vehicle access. But there is still concern with pickup and drop off of 16 kids coming and going all day. And so one of the things that I was kind of thinking about was, well, how can we manage this and put some obligation on the property owner to work with their clients to be organized in a pickup and drop off. And I provided a kind of a sketch as to maybe a circulation plan that could help just facilitate if we get everybody coordinated. Because they face west, I think it makes sense to request that property or that clients of this property owner enter in on 330 East, make the loop around, and drop off facing north, so they're not on the other side of the street with kids having to cross. They don't necessarily need to pull into the driveway and then do a back out maneuver to leave after drop off. I think it would make it a little bit easier, but it would require some coordination and some communication on the part of the property owner. So that is the recommendation to mitigate some potential or some anticipated detrimental impacts. Again, with conditional use permits, they are a property right, but the Planning Commission can impose conditions, but those conditions need to be associated with anticipated detrimental impacts. So if you have other thoughts or ideas for conditions of approval, just kind of keep that in mind. And they do need to be based on findings. And we can't eliminate the detrimental impacts, but we can mitigate. It's a state code requirement. So additionally, in addition to the pickup and drop-off circulation recommendation, the property owner is going to need to go through the business licensing update. So they need to update their business license from 8 to 16, that instigates the need to do those inspections by the fire marshal, building inspector, and the police department. But again, the state licensing and inspections have been completed, so the interior of the home has been reviewed. We don't have standards in our code that dictate what the interior of a home must look like or be configured, so it's hard to impose conditions in that regard. But again, I think that the circulation and the drop-off is one of the bigger concerns for safety. If you have questions or any thoughts as part of this request?
I asked these 2 things. I really like the drawing you did. It makes sense to me. Can that be part of the motion that
Yeah.
actually happened?
Yeah, if you were to make a motion to adopt the conditions and finding the staff report,
That would be included in that.
yeah, let me scroll down to this third condition just so you can read it again. So I said that a pickup and drop-off circulation plan shall be coordinated with the parents or guardians of the children to enter the neighborhood off the 2600 North through 330 East, loop around the 370 East, and pick up or drop off the vehicles facing north along the Holmes Street frontage and exiting the neighborhood heading northbound on 370 East. And then C, the applicable circulation plan exhibit above. So I think if you adopt that,
But it
it's
can't
big
expect.
deal.
Okay, my other question was, and I I didn't get it exactly from this. It might be a question that we wanted here. But on the drop off and pick up, are parents required to leave the car to do that, or did somebody say the daycare come out?
We don't know. I don't know if there's a state requirement under their
Oh, I
adopted
did- just for
licensing.
it all makes sense if parents aren't parking. Because it says later that if they want to come in, they park in the,
In the driveway.
but it made it sound like that they don't,
Good.
they don't get out of their car, but I just,
Yeah, that is a good question. I think we have our applicant that might be able to answer some of those questions. Yeah. Ashley?
do the parents have to get out of the car to take the child to the house, or does somebody from the daycare meet the child at the car or take them out to the car? Oh, because the parents could just let them out of the car and they run in. Okay.
Would you come up to microphone so we can hear and the people listening can hear, please? Thank you. So you said either way?
Yeah.
Depends on the
Really
age?
just what the parent wants to do also. And it usually never causes any chaos right there either. And they usually just knock, I open the door, they go right in, and then they leave. It's not like they're there for longer than a minute.
So if they're going to, then they park in your driveway
Mhm.
and they come in and bring the
Mhm.
child?
My driveway or the front of my house.
Okay.
So it's a daycare and not a preschool, or is it both? Like, do some kids come every day at 9 o'clock and leave at 11:30, or?
No, usually they come and go at different times, but usually it's around 8:30 in the morning until 5:30 p.m.
Okay,
So
so it's all
daycare.
day. So
Mhm.
it's depending on what.
But depends. Some do have school, so they get picked up around 11:30. Some get dropped off at 3 after school, so they come at all times of the day.
So that was a question I had. What are your hours? Not 24
6 till
hours.
6.
6 till 6.
Mhm.
Okay. Any other questions? Gavin? Yeah.
For staff,
Thank you.
so does North Logan have a noise ordinance? And if so, how does that apply?
Yeah, it's part of our nuisance ordinance, and it talks about if it becomes more than what is customary in a residential setting, then it becomes a nuisance. It's really hard for us to enforce because it's always just a point in time, right? We don't have like a decibel meter to read or measure, so it's a tough one. But as a condition, if you're concerned about noise, it's something you could impose to say, hey, hours of operation is one thing. But if there's a noise complaint, then we have to use the nuisance ordinance. Our code enforcement officer would have to have something to go off of to prove that it's more than is reasonable. It's a tough one to impose or to regulate. But we do have that in a nuisance ordinance for noise.
So with that, if there were repeated issues, that would impact business through standard process.
Yeah, so if, for example, they are found in violation of the nuisance ordinance and we're able to collect enough information to show that it's above and beyond what is reasonable for the quiet and peaceful enjoyment of the neighbor's property, then technically, we could revoke the business license because it's a home-based business license, and if there's a code enforcement case open, then we could use that to leverage and to say, hey, you need to address this, or else you're going to lose your business license. If it was made a condition of approval of the conditional use permit, then we could also use that to say you're in violation of the conditional use permit. So either mechanism could be applied, but if you were concerned about noise, if you wanted to add hours of operation as conditions of approval, we could put those into motion. It's up to you.
I would say to the commission, I think the standard.
My only concern, and I don't know how we would even do this, it's speed limit through the neighborhood. I mean, they're going down and around and going through 2 neighborhoods. We don't have any control over that. Is there a speed sign up? how do we deal with that issue?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of just defaults to a moving violation that's enforced by the police department if found to be above the speed limit. Again, this is a local street, so 25 miles an hour is the standard speed limit for a local street. We don't really put in a lot of, traffic calming, other than street trees. If we were to put down like a speed bump, it tears up our speed or snow plows. So it's not something we really instigate per se. It's just if there is a speeding issue, we would call the police department and say, hey, you guys want to patrol this area a little bit and see if we can quell whatever issue might be happening.
Okay, so neighbors could do that if they
Yeah.
saw a continual problem.
Yeah.
Okay. Are we ready to make a motion? I think are we in agreement of what we're feeling here? Porter?
I just wanted one comment. With my building department background, I know this isn't the scope of our meeting, but I appreciate seeing that that building safety is being considered as well. That's a big thing for me to consider the safety and comfort of the kids there. So trust that they'll handle all that. But as far as land use goes, I see no.
I think with all of the conditions that the staff has recommended. To go with. Gavin?
I move that we approve the conditional use permit to operate a home-based day facility with an operational capacity up to 16 children, subject to the 3 conditions listed in the staff report and incorporating the four facts and findings in the staff.
All right, it has been moved and Gavin moved and Porter seconded that we extend a positive recommendation onto the city council. No, positive recommendation from us
And approve.
Your
and approval for the Newman Daycare expansion. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, great.
Good luck.
Just want to say thanks to the applicants for being here. We'll be in touch on next steps. You're welcome to stay. You're welcome to head out. It's up to you guys.
Okay.
You're welcome.
Thank you. All right, let's move on to item number 4. Scott.
Okay, you guys ready to jump back into code amendments? So this is a work session, so there's no formal action that is taken. It's just for us to dialogue openly about some of the draft materials that our consulting teams are working on to implement our general plan, vision, goals into the code. So for those in the audience and those online, we adopted a new general plan back in February. And that new general plan has all sorts of goals and vision items for multiple topics: land use, transportation, parks, trails, utilities, you name it, housing. It's all in that plan. It's a very comprehensive, multi-100-page plan. So now that that plan is adopted, our next step is to take what is in the plan, those recommendations, and try to codify it into our regulations. So when we make changes, we have the regulations that reflect the desire of our general plan. So just want to give enough background for those who may be listening and those in the audience that we have been working on packets of text amendments for Title 12, which is our land use ordinance. And we've been working from the beginning, and we're kind of midway through subsection C, which is our zoning ordinance. So we looked at it from a broad perspective at our last meeting. We looked at it top to bottom. There's about 300 pages with all the red lines that are initially proposed, and it's a lot to wrap your head around. And so I wanted to provide that discussion last week just to help everyone understand the pieces that are moving around and just the larger scope of Title 12C. But today we're going to talk very much more acutely about a couple of things. First and foremost is our land use table. So the land use table is essentially a large matrix that lists all of the zoning classifications in town and all the potential land uses and whether those land uses are permitted, conditionally permitted, not permitted, or might be permitted as part of a mixed use project, top to bottom. And we took that out and it's still 29 pages of tables. So it is a little bit of a study for everybody to look through to understand, but this really is where the rubber hits the road. So when somebody calls in and says, hey, I own a piece of property in the R112 residential zone, can I build an ADU? We go to the table, we say, yeah, in a residential zone, with accessory dwelling unit is a permitted use. You can submit a building permit and go through that process. Or if it's in the commercial general zone on Main Street and they want to put in a junkyard, we say, hey, sorry, that's not a permitted use. You're not able to do that. So our city is essentially broken into multiple zoning classifications based on its geographic location. The zoning map governs what is applied to each property. And then it is still down into these land use tables to see more specifically what is and what is not permitted and what can. So as we went through the general plan identifies different goals for different areas of town. There's a couple of new areas in town. And I'm going to go to our general plan website, and this is where anybody in the public or anybody here in the room, if they want to follow along, to go to NLC Plan. And this is where, when we first started this project back in late 2023, we put together this website as a clearinghouse for all documentation and information. This website is still active. We are continuing to use it to put all of these draft materials online so everybody can follow along, study it as we go through the Planning Commission workshops towards adoption. But this is that page, so nlcplan.org. If you scroll down, there are several links. Here is the adopted general plan. So if anybody wants to read the adopted general plan, that's where you can gain access. The city center master plan is also listed here. That was also adopted recently. And then further to the right, you'll see all of these draft amendments. So 12A, 12B, we reviewed those previously with the Planning Commission. We're now looking at 12C. But before I get into the details there, I want to go back to the general plan itself. And I want to just pull back up our future land use map. And the future land use map, I would argue, is probably the most important exhibit in the plan because it graphically depicts different development districts, future development districts. That's why it's called a future land use map. Sorry, I scrolled too far. So this is that exhibit. This is the future land use map. And we need to be clear, this is not the zoning map. This is not a governing exhibit. It is a policy guide exhibit that will direct future zoning changes as they are requested or as the city council may see necessary to change zoning if they wanted to go and do it proactively. So in this future land use map, some of the new things that were adopted as part of this general plan was a vision for 2500 North. We wanted to put a facelift on 2500 North. We wanted a proud gateway into our city. We recognize that for many decades, 2500 North served as an industrial area and it served its purpose for the time. But as we've grown up as a city, the public had a vision that it would be much more aesthetically pleasing, higher intensity commercial uses. And so that was a vision and a goal that was adopted in the general plan. And so what we need to do is we need to create new zoning for that vision to come to fruition. And in that new zoning, we need to indicate what uses are permitted, what uses are not permitted, and what development standards and design guidelines are required for new development. So we'll be talking about that today for 2500 North. And also for this area in green, which is another district that was identified and adopted in the general plan that we call the Wolfpack Way corridor. Wolfpack Way is a newer corridor and it's continuing to evolve in its connectivity between communities, and its potential is changing with its future growth. So this is also a development district that at the moment in the existing land use code, we don't have a zoning classification for. We don't have it as part of our land use tables. And so in order to bring these two new zoning classifications into our code, we need to create sections for them that describe what is and is not allowed. And we need to add them to our land use tables and decide which uses can or cannot be approved in those districts. So that's what we want to talk about today. We want to talk about the 2500 North Gateway, the east side, which is east of Main Street, and then the west side, which is west of Main Street. There's two separate sides of that gateway, and then Wolfpack Road. And then we also want to talk about the land use tables as a whole. So I hope I teed that up okay so we can get the context before we dive into the tables here. Okay. So let's go and read the new language associated with 2500 North and Wolfpack Way. And what we want to understand with this draft language is, does it follow the vision that's outlined in the general plan for those two districts? Okay. And before we read this, let me actually, as I'm thinking about it, let me scroll down in the general plan so we can see what the general plan called for before we read that new draft language. So in the plan, the land use section starts with the future land use map. That's the top of the land use section. And then as you scroll further down, we break out each of those districts that are depicted on the map into subsections to discuss what are the characteristics, what are some of the typical development patterns, where is it located, what are some of the public comments that we received during the general plan that helped us form this vision. What are some of the fiscal impacts, water impacts? But really, we want to start looking at what are the strategic priorities for each of those districts, so we know that our draft language is following those strategic priorities. So I'm going to scroll up just a little bit, and let's read this top paragraph. It says, the 2500 North Gateway District aims to create a welcoming and visually appealing entrance to North Logan while supporting economic growth through a mix of hospitality, office, and commercial uses. It seeks to establish a positive community identity through high-quality development standards and attractive streetscape enhancements with distinct characteristics for its western and eastern sections. So in broad sense, what this district is trying to do. So then let's take a look at some of these photos. What we're looking for here is just a higher class commercial. That's why it says hospitality, food and beverage. We really want to have a welcoming entrance, so signage. We want to depict when it is that you're entering North Logan, so folks know when they have entered the city. So you see these two entry signs shown, and then some Class A office, perhaps some retail and some food and beverage. Okay. So let's then go back to this language for 2500 North. And did you guys get a chance to read through this as far as your prep? Through your prep, was there anything in this language that you felt like was not matching the vision that was established in the general plan? I believe that this purpose language is substantially copied and pasted out of the general plan. We want to implement the community's vision as a gateway corridor. We want to create a welcoming and visually appealing entrance to the city. And then it talks about streetscape, placemaking elements, positive visual identity. We want innovative architecture. And we want to transition away from the manufacturing areas of the adjacent land uses. And I'm going to scroll back up. So 2500 North Gateway, there's manufacturing, commercial, heavier intensity uses to the north and then also to the south. So we want to transition away from those and be more aesthetically pleasing development pattern along the road. Any thoughts or questions on this initial draft language for the purpose of that zone?
Oh, looks good to me. We talked about it. I think we talked about that.
Okay. One thing I want to just point out to the east of Main Street. So again, 2500 North, this district is split west versus east, and that's how the language is drafted. There's obviously no residential allowances west of Main Street. We don't want to have any residential out in that area. East of Main Street, there is some residential contemplated, but I put a couple of comments in. I really don't know that we want to have any residential between Main Street and Wolfpack Way. I think that those are some high potential areas for non-residential uses that we should preserve for those potential outcomes. East of Wolfpack Way, I think, is where we had thought that that's where maybe some higher intensity residential might be more appropriate. In the language, I made some adjustments, right? At least a recommendation that we specifically call out owner-occupied single-family attached. And as you'll recall, when we were talking about the city center master plan versus the rest of the general plan for everything outside of the city center, we recognize that the city center would likely have some rental units, and we're going to try really hard to have a high percentage owner occupancy in the city center. But outside of the city center core, we really want to have owner occupied, and we want to almost say no attached rental housing. We want to accommodate that in the city center to an extent, but outside of the city center, if it's going to be attached housing, so townhomes, condos, we want it owner occupied. That is a really high priority that was called out in the general plan. So in this section, I did indicate that we want owner occupied single family attached, meaning condo or townhome only, no stacked flat apartments. The other thing is we want to call out specifically that the residential allowance is east of Wolfpack Way and not west of Wolfpack Way. So I think those are two things that we would like to add into some of this language. Any thoughts on that? Do you feel like we're headed in the right direction with where that draft language is? Okay, there's obviously going to be more to come. I wanted to look at this purpose section first. We will start talking more about the development standards, some of the parking standards, signage. So we'll add more to this language, obviously. We want to make sure we're kind of off to the right direction. We want to follow the vision of the general plan as we're drafting forward. Okay, so that's 2500 North. I'm going to scroll up to Wolfpack Way. This has its own subsection as well. Let's go back to the map here. When we were drafting the general plan, we knew that there was overlap of Wolfpack Way, 2500 North. This is a crossroads, so to speak. We knew Wolfpack Way was going to be more of a mixed-use corridor, and it ties into the city center corridor area. I don't even call it a corridor per se, but the city center itself has an appendage that heads northward, and that's kind of tying into Wolfpack Way, overlapping this gateway vision, this appealing entry corridor. So a lot of the Wolfpack Way and city center is going to be pretty close, I think, in how we draft the language. A lot of it will be mixed use, higher development standards, and aesthetics, landscaping. This entry corridor will differentiate a little bit with the entry itself being a key element. But Wolfpack Way, again, mixed use. One of the things we wanted to do is we wanted to help transition away from the existing neighborhoods to the east. So especially this neighborhood here, we knew that we wanted to make sure that we didn't go from single-family residential homes here and go directly to a mixed-use type of a setting. We want to transition gradually and find a way to do that without having abrupt, we call it an urban transect change. We're going from something that's two-story residential to 3 or 4, something that gradually increases and transition smoothly. So that is anticipated, and I think some of that language does speak to that desire in what is drafted now. Again, we want that owner-occupied housing. And what was interesting here is I made a comment. I haven't changed it yet because I wanted us to have this discussion. As it's drafted now, it says predominantly owner-occupied multifamily housing. And I was thinking, what's the difference between owner-occupied multifamily housing and owner-occupied single-family attached? And there's a difference there, right? It kind of sounds the same, but there's a difference. I was like, I'm going to ask Google what it thinks and have AI maybe spit something out. And what it spat out was single-family attached housing refers to individual single-family homes that share a common wall or walls with another single-family home or homes. While owner-occupied multifamily housing refers to a building with multiple residential units all owned by the same person. I feel like that's kind of like a house with a super, where you got one guy who lives there who might own it, but it's his
Yes.
He lives in one of the.
he ends in one, right?
Yes.
And I want to make sure that it's clear. That's not the intent here. We want, single family ownership. So one family lives in one dwelling, but that they are attached for affordability and for, increasing the density slightly. And we want to make sure that it's not an institutional ownership type of a situation. So I believe that we will go ahead and change that to owner-occupied, single-family attached.
Well, it would just be the same as the other.
It would be the same as the other one.
That makes more sense.
So, and that's the intent. We want to make sure that is,
I think it makes it no question.
It was.
It makes it no question about, that's
Yeah.
good.
again, townhomes meet this definition. Single-family, you own the deed to that property, but you share a common wall with your neighbor.
Mhm.
Condominiums, stacked flat condominiums, you share perhaps the ceiling with the neighbor or the ceiling and the floor and your two walls with your neighbors, but you own the deed to the property. You're gaining equity. You can sell it. You're still able to have a foot in the ownership game, and very different from a multifamily type of a term. So
Here for this, how do we enforce certain owner occupancy requirements?
that is the crux of everything, right? If you can't ensure it comes to fruition, what is the point? So we recognize locally that there is not a good mechanism to do this. There's deed restrictions, and we can say, hey, we'll approve this project if you deed restrict it for owner occupancy. And so the developer says, sure, we can do that. We'll deed restrict it. And they put a deed restriction on the property. But then who is monitoring the transaction of those units? Maybe the first one gets monitored, but 2 years later, someone moves out and someone moves in. And then they move out and rent it. Maybe they still own it, but they are renting it. And we don't want to leave it with an HOA because I've personally seen an HOA. My brother specifically owned a condo in an HOA, is a townhome actually, in an HOA in Layton, and their CCNR said no more than 30% of the units can convert into rental properties. But by the time he moved out, 85% of them were all rental properties. So someone owned it, but they just moved out onto their next housing option, but kept it in their pool of assets and decided to rent it. So we don't want to have the HOA because the HOA didn't really enforce that. One of the things that we've started talking about locally with some of the local planners, we discuss regional topics, is we need to have a housing authority. We need an entity who can monitor these types of projects and products that come to fruition. They exist elsewhere in the state. For example, Summit County, probably the most critical housing affordability area in the state. Summit County has their own housing authority, and when a deed restriction is applied to a property, it's actually in favor of the housing authority. So the housing authority is monitoring all the transactions in perpetuity, that the next tenant or the next person who purchases a property is eligible. And they also monitor that they are still living in that property if a couple years go by, they verify they're still occupying the residence. Park City Municipal, internally they have staff that does this. They're big enough, they have a big enough budget, they have internal staff that monitors within their municipal boundary their deed restrictions. So there's this element that we are missing in CashVal. Bragg does have a housing department, and they oversee some of the federal low-income housing credit types of properties, but we don't have that mechanism yet. That's a bigger thing we need to talk about regionally to bring to fruition. So we want to put together what we have. The state is working behind the scenes on helping condominium developments, removing some of the barriers to condominium development. There's been some concern from the development community that condominiums represent a lot of liability because there's class action timelines that they're concerned about. Essentially, when they finish a project, they're on the hook for 7 years for any defects in the project, and so they could be gone for almost a decade and have a water leak, flood the whole thing, and that's a huge liability on their end. So they're working on that at the legislature level. There's also the private funding side of things. It's hard to fund those types of projects. There's lots of barriers, but I think that the state and the local municipalities are starting to push more in the direction of owner-occupied. It's been a higher point of discussion in our planning conferences, the Utah League of Cities and Towns. The legislature has been looking at those topics as well. I think we're all pushing in the right direction and we're laying that groundwork. But if we were to have a project come through the door tomorrow, and they're saying, hey, we'll be willing to do owner occupancy, we would say, that's what we want to do as well. And we need to have some more mechanisms in place. And perhaps, we say we'll do deed restrictions in favor of the city with language indicating it can transfer over to a housing authority if and when such an entity comes to fruition. But these are all things that we're working on, trying to figure out.
Can this be done?
Yeah, because they can still say we are willing to do owner occupancy, and we can figure out the mechanism with a proposal. That mechanism we might have to negotiate and figure out how that works and how we are all assured that it will come to fruition in the short term, but also in the long term. That might be where we work with a developer and say, look, we want you to build something like this, but we also have to be assured that we will owner occupied. What is the mechanism that you feel like could be instigated in the short term and then also in the long term working towards that solution. So future yeah, we don't think that a housing authority would be involved unless the restriction is applied to a particular property to which they are essentially the entity that restriction is granted towards. It wouldn't necessarily cover every single property unless we were to say like the housing authority, they have these powers and authorities broadly, but unless it's granted the restriction, and it's granted in their favor for their oversight and perpetuity, that's when they would step in again and if the property has that element attached to it. We don't think that no building itself is big enough. There's not obviously a need to have dedicated staff and budget to oversee deed restrictions in just a small municipality. It's got to be a regional thing. And that's why you see like Weber County has a Weber County Housing Authority just over all of Weber County. Summit County, same thing. So they exist. They just don't exist in Cache Valley.
So predominantly, if it played itself out, it would predominantly affect new subdivisions. That's when you would put deed restrictions.
If they were attached housing product. So we would have to decide which developments need to have this extra layer of surety that it remain owner occupied. Because right now, if we approve a single family subdivision, there's no requirement that they remain owner occupied. The majority of them do because people own it as their primary residence. But in every neighborhood, folks will move out and they'll keep it if they have the means to keep it. They'll rent it. And they'll just keep it a part of their retirement portfolio. And some neighborhoods have higher percentages than others, and it's really something that the free market figures out.
I would assume in some of people
Yep.
buying single family homes.
It is, yeah, and what's interesting about Summit County, because it has such a high threshold of cost, and because they struggle to get workforce housing, they have mechanisms when they approve, for example, a new hotel, the developer has to build workforce housing units as part of that hotel approval. And so they'll either build them into the building itself or they'll find land elsewhere in Summit County and build that specifically for their workforce demand. And then they'll be restricted and give it over to a housing authority to monitor in perpetuity. We're certainly not to that point yet. Summit County and Park City, they struggle to hire teachers and police and all of just the critical functions just because of how expensive housing is. So whenever they approve anything new, workforce housing is a big discussion point.
So when Gavin asked that question, I thought maybe we could just go down the path of how do you incentivize developers to build owner occupied?
Mm-hmm.
So certainly the housing authority discussion, make sure they stay owner occupied is good. But what are we doing in the code to incentivize or encourage owner occupied?
I think in this situation, they don't need to incentivize because they can't build it unless it is owner occupied. So it's not us saying, hey, would you please put in 50%?
So the incentive is that's the only.
Yeah, it just wouldn't be approved if it wasn't an owner occupied product.
Because you're putting owner occupied in code.
So that is the allowed use though, is the.
Yeah, if we were to leave it silent and we would So here's where the mechanism would come in. If we don't change the zoning on the underlying property and we leave it to the current zone, which right now on Wolfpack Way is all general commercial. If we don't change the zoning, we allow a property owner to come to us with a zone change request. That's a legislative action, and we could say, yeah, we'll change your zone. We want to know what it is that you're going to do. We want to know what it looks like, and the parameters of the occupancy and the ownership. And if they were to come to us and say, hey, we think we can do 50-50, 50% owner occupied, 50 rental, and we'd say, well, we're not obligated to give you this zone change. The general plan supports it, and there is a pathway to success, but we think it should be a 60-40 split. That's where we can negotiate and say, well, at some point we feel like it is a threshold that we are okay to cross. But I also think that the general plan was very specific that we would allow some of the rental to a certain point in the city center. Outside of the city center, if it's going to be an attached housing product, we want it to be unoccupied. So I don't really feel like we would want to do much negotiating in that situation.
So just to be clear, so like, for example, in A that's highlighted on the screen right now, so mixed use development, including the owner occupied, where you're doing this same language in other districts that are predominantly zoned single family, you wouldn't have language such as single family developments being owner.
Yeah, because if it was detached single family, I think that's where we say, look, the free market has kept most neighborhoods, owner occupied. But that does bring up a question or a thought. As I was reading this predominantly, I think that we need to not have language that has any open permissibility.
And wiggle space. So I think we get rid of predominantly.
Unless we want with this.
Well, I don't think we want wiggle space. That's why we're saying.
And that's a good question. This is policy discussion, right? This is how things come together. But I think that discussion was had with the general plan. We said, look, if we're going to start allowing for attached housing product, we want it along Wolfpack Way and in the city center. But along Wolfpack Way, let's just stick with owner occupied and bring that type of a product online.
It makes it easier for us in the long run.
It's a comment consistent with the discussions during the general.
Right.
Yeah. But the general plan, again, it's advisory, right? It's giving us a vision. It's giving us some parameters. And this is where we're really putting the policy in the code. So we can draft as we feel like we would like to draft. We'll make a recommendation to the city council and we'll say, we believe that the code as it's currently drafted does its best to implement the vision of the general plan. And they may want to make some adjustments here and there, but I think for the most part, as long as we stick with what the general plan is looking for, I think we'll find it'll be accepted. Okay, any other questions on these two zoning districts, the 2500 North Gateway, Wolfpack Way corridor? I feel like we're kind of on the right path on those. Let's go look at the land use tables, and this I'm not going to go into great detail because it's overwhelming even in its truncated form.
Just said I can't build a cabin anywhere.
Yeah, and that's actually, when I read that, I was thinking, I worked in Weber County, and in the Ogden Valley, they have some subdivisions that were built in the 50s that were dry cabin subdivisions, meaning they don't have any facilities. It's just a cabin. It doesn't have any connection. They do have a septic tank, but they have a well, and they don't have any connection to the outside world. They don't have power. Some people have put solar in. They don't have gas. They use propane, but at the time it was just a cabin, and they used like an outhouse back in the 50s. But as time has gone on, most folks who've bought this property realize I'm not going to use an outhouse. I'm going to install a septic system. And hopefully I can get well water and drill a well on the Brantford. But yeah, I think in our code, that's what the cabin plan is.
Didn't look at the definition. I'm sure
It is. So I did give you both. So in that paperwork in front of you, we gave you the definitions because as you're reading through the tables, it's good to have the definition to know, well, what is that exactly? Like, what is this thing? Okay. I'm going to just kind of scroll through. The tables are split up into a couple different subtables, but we've got the agricultural, residential, zones, and the zones are in the columns here. And then the lines are all of the uses, right? And then B permitted, X not permitted, C conditionally permitted, and then the PC is meeting of the planning commission as the land use authority. There are some things in here that it's a CC, or it's a special use permit where the city council is the land use authority, and it is indicated as such. But in my email to you guys, I said just for now, focus on the cream colored land uses, because these are actually new lines that we're adding in because they didn't exist in our existing tables. They do exist as defined uses in state code, and so we felt let's add all of these that are missing out of our table and apply a specific permissibility to them. Bed and breakfast, it's essentially a short-term rental, but it's owner occupied, so maybe even a little bit less impactful. So again, it's a conditional use permit it's consistent with our existing short-term rental requirements. But I want to go down a little bit further into the commercial and mixed use zones. So it's in a table further down. So here we go. Here's our professional, hospital, residential business, community commercial, commercial general, manufacturing commercial, and our high-tech manufacturing and research. This is I feel like where the zoning classifications we just discussed are going to be depicted in these tables. So our new Wolfpack Way corridor and our 2500 North Gateway East and West are going to be added into these tables. Let me go down just a little bit further. Okay, yeah, this is our mixed use table. So this is where you'll see, here's the new Wolfpack Way corridor, Gateway Commercial, or sorry, 2500 North, East and West are separated into two columns. Recreation School, essentially this zone is just Green Canyon High School and that Cash Recreation Center around Green Canyon. In yellow, these are our existing city center zoning classifications. So in the city center, we've got single family 6, multifamily 7, so it's mixed residential 7, 8. Downtown, that's the 3rd East, what is now the pedestrian walkway chicane. City center adjacent, city center commercial. What we anticipate, and the reason why it is highlighted in yellow is we think we're probably going to scrap these zones and adopt the form-based code for our city center. We likely will have a city center core and a city center adjacent. So again, the core is between 2nd East, 4th East, and 200 North. That's the core, the crux of that city center master plan. And then everything on the perimeter outside of the core will be that city center adjacent. But I anticipate everything in yellow. We'll scrap it. We'll put in the new zone, and that's what our other consulting team is working on with the form-based code. Okay, we'll have a look at that on the 24th. We'll talk more about that later. But you have a question?
So just the mechanic. So if we go through and make this the new code and we scrap zones, that doesn't change the zone. I guess that's
correct. So we'll actually leave them in there. So Porter, you live in a city center related zone. You're in an SF6 zone. So your neighborhood is this column. We essentially are saying that it's a legacy zone. We'll leave this in here so if there's ever a modification to your neighborhood, the property owner says, hey, can I do this with my property? We'll say, actually, no. Or city council, planning commission may decide, no, we need to change the zone of all the perimeter zones to a city center adjacent, which would be consistent with what is there now, plus maybe what the rest of the city center master plan calls for. I don't know that we will do that. I think that we will leave the existing neighborhoods zoned as they currently are, but we will retire those zoning classifications and say the undeveloped properties in the city center boundary are now governed by that new zoning that is being created as we speak. So a good point of clarification mechanically, if Porter comes and asks me, hey, can I put an ADU in my backyard? It's good for us to make sure we still have the column and the uses that are or are not permissible, but we will not be using it for future development.
So if Porter wanted to do that, his legacy zone didn't allow intended, or the planning map did allow it, he could apply for a zoning change on his property.
So if we go back to the city center master plan, let's just go look at it real quick. It's too big. All right, it's a very graphic intensive document. But as you'll remember, the core is very well planned. It is hyper specific with massing heights of buildings, where streets and walkways are going to go. The perimeter was a little bit more loosely defined and will be more so defined with the form-based code that is being generated. What I would anticipate, so here's the boundary. Everything in white is the city center boundary. Some of these parcels are already developed, but we wanted to just highlight the city center boundary in this plan. Let's go down. Here's our existing zoning for the area. So here's our existing zones. This neighborhood, I'll just use Porter's neighborhood because it's easy to use, right? It's zoned SF6. It is already developed, and it's not. There's no vacant land to be developed in this area, so that zone will just stay with it. The rest of the area that's undeveloped. So let's actually look at this one to the south of Porter. Undeveloped. They've come in to ask for a zone change. We said no. Let's wait until the general plan is done. And let's get the planning cart before the horse here. And cart before the horse, other way around. Let's get the horse before the cart. Anyway, so because this is undeveloped, the new form-based code would then be applicable to its future development. And it doesn't necessarily need to stick with SF6 unless we allow it to stay SF6. My assumption is that whoever owns the property will not want to keep it SF6 because the general plan, or sorry, the city center master plan provides additional allowances that they likely will want to keep it in. Let me go further down to so again, here's the core, very, very specifically planned out. Everything around here, that form-based code will govern future development. But my assumption is we won't change the zoning of Porter's neighborhood to form-based code. We'll leave it as SF6 as a legacy zone.
But if you wanted to, you could apply
Anybody can ask for a zone change, but we would come back and say, look, the city center master plan didn't anticipate your neighborhood changing to this mixed use or this form-based code zone.
So the legacy zone could be
Yeah, it would, unless we wanted to change the zoning and say, look, there's no more SF6 anywhere in town that requires us to keep a regulatory element, and we could mix that up. There are a couple of zones where that could maybe come to fruition at some point. Let's go back to the plan, zoning map. So there's a couple of these unique zones. Like this hashed red. There's not very many of them. There's a few of them. They're what we call the community commercial zones. It's kind of an older commercial zone designation that very few parcels are using. The council could just say, hey, we're just going to change this to residential business, or we're going to change it to another commercial, and we could say we're going to make this a legacy zone, because they've all changed their zoning. The council could just change all of the zoning. We could then pull it up with
Can we go back to something you said about the form-based code?
Yeah.
So picking on me and my neighborhood again, that parcel south of my subdivision, not very bad. You said if we go to form-based codes,
if you look in this city center master plan, if you look at this exhibit, when we were putting this together, Planning Commission City Council looked at this whole region, and as a planning exercise, we said, what uses might work in different areas. And so the different colors mean different things. So purple, mixed use. This yellow is single family detached. And we looked throughout this whole area, for example, down, by, this is the fun park here, north of the fun park. We said, let's keep that as a predominantly commercial. The form-based code is going to govern form over use, but it won't entirely abandon use. So even though this area has different colors depicted on it, it essentially says, hey, we anticipate there being single-family detached around the perimeter, a potential mixed use on the interior, but the form-based code, it governs the materials, it governs what it looks like. It'll still govern a little bit of the use. So we're not going to say we're going to put something heavy intensity in there, but it will have looser parameters on use and higher expectations on form.
So I know that the community has come out in opposition to some development there in favor of use that matches the neighboring. So if this goes to mixed use, what is the form based? What is that allowed to look like? Are we talking multi-story?
This is good questions, and I don't think it's fully defined yet. And so as we work through the form-based code, I think those are things that will be fleshed out as we go through it from top to bottom. This exhibit in the city center master plan is not a governing exhibit. It's basically saying when we work together with the steering committee and the planning commission city council on just rough, this is very high level building blocks. What types of uses could be put in different places? And we knew that, for example, on this corner property, it's a vacant property right now. We knew that there was probably a good opportunity for maybe some more medical or medical office along the frontage on 4th. But we didn't want it to be entirely commercial, and so we put it kind of just this rough split to say we probably should put some single-family residential to buffer to the east, and then maybe we'll put some medical office and maybe some mixes of uses on that west side of the parcel. It's kind of the same idea here. We knew we wanted a buffer with single-family detached. The interior here is still a little bit less defined. The form-based, again, is going to be very specific on materials, some massing. So we'll get into more detail on the perimeter properties. The center, like I mentioned, the core, hyper specific as to what is going to happen there. The perimeter, a little bit less specific, but more opportunity to define that through this form-based code.
I think my primary concern is that we've talked about it before, but that's stepping down of use, of density and of use as you go away from the city center. So
yep,
I'd like to see that. Curious how we accomplish that with form-based.
I think there's more discussion to be had. Yeah. I think let's not get too far into the weeds on some of those things. I think for the time being, let's close this for a second. This table will be something we'll want to look at. And the table hasn't been updated yet with the city center classifications. It's kind of a holding place. We have 2 consulting teams working on 2 projects. Our general plan consulting team is going through the text amendments of the code as a whole. And then our downtown redevelopment team, the team that did the city center master plan, they're creating the form-based code, and we anticipate adding into this table and shrinking it down from these zones to just those 2 potential zones. Again, that's still loosely defined.
So as they talk about it, if in that little area that we're talking about, we say, no, we want to keep it single family, what then? And that's what passes, it stays, right?
You can still stay single family, but it would still have to go through the form-based requirements. So the materials, architectural styling, that would still be applicable because it's still in the city center boundary. But we may just say, look, the use is in this area.
In this area, but it could still stay zoned single family.
If you wanted it to.
If you want to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, there's a lot of discussion on it, so keep that in mind. I'm not going to go through all of this in great detail. I did go through top to bottom, and I did add my assumptions for some of these things, like a pawnbroker. It's not going to be permitted. We just don't want a pawn. I don't feel like that fits our community character or what the public is asking us to do. But we want to have it in the code, so if anybody asks us, hey, can I put it in a pawn shop? Say sorry, it's just not a permitted use. Same thing with a junkyard. So I went through and added my assumptions here. I think this is going to be a bigger homework assignment, so don't feel like all of the dialogue and all the review has to be done here in this meeting. My expectation, I think, is that you guys take a minute, read through it. Feel free to hop in here. There's a Google Cloud document. You guys can make some comments and some edits if you'd like to. So,
I was just gonna say, I did notice there was a theater in here.
a theater. It's actually a good point.
We're not gonna talk about that right
But that would come as one of these replacement areas.
Oh,
The other question, you didn't have to comment.
so some of them are blank. Is that
Yeah, these in this yellow area, this I haven't even touched. It's basically us just saying that's what is existing now. It's highlighted yellow with the assumption that we're going to pull this out or leave some of these rows in unchanged from what the current zoning allows and add in whatever that new city center looks like. So this is a work in progress still.
so when would be the best value for us to invest our time to go through this detail? Is it now? Is it
I do think so. It is now, especially with these new districts that we are creating. Everything in yellow, I think, will come back to. Everything outside of yellow, I think it's time for us to look at right now. And I did make some adjustments, in some of our existing zones. Like for example, a pet boarding daycare, I feel like that should require conditional use no matter where it's located. And so I did make some of these just assumptions, thinking, hey, that probably needs to be thought about again. There's still some work that I know we want to do with regards to parking and outdoor storage. But that's kind of a tricky one for us to enforce because we have folks that have outdoor storage, but it's material associated with the business or it's inventory associated with the business. But we also have parcels that are just parking a bunch of junk, and so that's where we need to be a little bit more specific as to what is permitted to be outdoors. Is it associated with the business? If it is, it probably should be screened or landscaped in a way that it's not visible from the right of way. I mean, most businesses want to do that anyways, just for security purposes, but we want to be more specific. We have issues with folks parking RV trailers and toys on parcels that are not associated with the business use, not associated with the residential use, and it's just kind of outdoor storage that's turning into, a bit of an issue, just sprinkled all over. We just need to define what is and what is not permitted, so we have a better mechanism to say what is and what is not. So if you want to go through this, take a look. Let me know if you feel like we've taken an assumption and a direction maybe you think we need to adjust. But again, we'll be talking about more 12C items in our next planning commission meetings. 12C is a big lift. This is one of the bigger sections. So we're certainly not out of the woods yet, but we did pull out the land use tables as a more specific discussion because it is heavily policy implementation, rubber hits the road type of a place. So any questions on these items? Again, for the public, if they're curious, if you want to follow along, if you want to read, it's a lot of information. The best place to go is msmplan.org. Scroll down. This is where all of the draft language is going to be. These are works in progress, so it's going to be changing throughout this process for the next several months. And we will take a final product to the city council once we feel like we're through the drafting phase. We have held a public hearing on 12A and 12B. We'll continue to hold individual public hearings as we go through the various sections, 12D, 12E, and we'll keep the public in the loop as far as opportunities to make formal public comments. But anybody who is in the public, you can come make a comment anytime. I want that to be clear. Make an appointment with me. Come to council if you want a copy of this in the meeting. Happy to print out the copy. there's opportunities for you to have that input the way through this. The ones that are in green are the ones that are adopted. So these two, this one is not green now because I already clicked on it, but these two, perfect. Yeah, but keep in mind they're going to continue to move around. We're going to keep making adjustments here and there. As we read further into the code, we may realize that something earlier in the code needs to be adjusted. And so we're going to keep the book open as we work through all of this. The way that a code is written is it references sections previous to it or after it. And we don't want to solidify anything until we've made all the adjustments we can do. Yep. And if you want to make comments, you can. All of these, they're Google-based documents. You can right-click on. So if you, for example, if you don't think a large warehouse should be in the M2 zone, you can right-click on it and say, add a comment, and say, let's rethink this, or I think this is a bad idea. You can add a comment, but that's something you can do at any time. If you don't like the digital format of this, then you can talk to them. But keep in mind, a copy is a static document, but happy to do that for anyone who's listening. This is a very big bit, and there's a lot of adjustments. So that's because Alan is signed into this. But if you were to do that, it would be. So more to come. Planning commissioners, feel free to study this out. If you want to make some comments as we continue, please do. I'm going to continue to be making some adjustments as we work with our consulting team. So keep in mind it's a very moving target for the time being. Yep.
Okay. That's it,
Okay.
Scott, for
Yep.
you. All right. We have a couple of things to discuss on the Staff Business National APA Conference.
We have one more item. I'm sorry.
What? Oh, sorry. I was moving us along here. Okay. Sorry, folks. We're on number 4. 5. Number 5. Okay. Work session. I'm still thinking about that theater in there, Scott. Okay. Review and discussion regarding draft zoning text amendments to both North Oregon City Design Standard.
Yes, Municipal Code, Section 12.
Yes. You want to tell us about that, Scott?
Yeah, so what we're looking at here, the reason why we have this as a work session is because we want to initiate some pending legislation, which is basically the city saying, let's start talking about this so we have a foot in the door. There's been a lot of changes at the legislature. The session just ended a couple weeks ago, and there's things that were adopted in the legislation that we feel like we need to make our own flavor of locally to make sure that we have specifically with this pending legislation, we want to talk about when subdivision improvements are installed, who's responsible to install those improvements, the timeline that is expected for those improvements to be installed, and some of the bonding requirements. And so we don't have to spend a ton of time on this, but I did want to put this out there so we can say that we've initiated this discussion. I anticipate taking all of these points and reading them into the open code amendments that we're already working on, so we don't have 2 projects going side by side. That's just more confusion than we need. But we do want to indicate certain things that we are working on as part of our code adjustments. So if somebody asks us, we can say, no, that's formally something we are considering as a city. So that we don't feel like we don't have the regulation in place that we need. So number 1, we want to talk about sidewalks within new subdivisions. Something new through the legislature. we used to, as communities, be able to tell a developer that the entire sidewalk throughout the whole subdivision has to be installed before you can pull a building permit. The legislators have said no, we're going to allow for developers to pull a building permit and can work on their sidewalks before a certificate of occupancy is issued. And what we're concerned about is that certain homes are completed and homeowners want occupancy to move in, but the developer has not installed certain improvements. We want to make sure those are complete before anybody moves into the neighborhood. The other thing is we don't want it to be piecemealed where we have just a little snippet of sidewalk here, there, because it never comes together quite as clean and as high quality as we would expect. Once it's installed by a developer, it's essentially handed over to the city in perpetuity, right? So we want to make sure that it's not meeting our standards, it's high quality, and it's not going to have issues. So what we're wanting to say with this particular our intention here is that sidewalks within new subdivisions need to be poured in no less than 400-foot increments. So it's essentially 4 blocks for the period at a time. Or if it's a smaller subdivision, then we can just complete that stretch to the end of that one. If it's 3-lot subdivision. Additionally, no sidewalk gaps may be left of less than 400 feet in length. If sidewalk pours of 400 feet through the gap of less than 400 feet, the gap must be included in the original scope of work to ensure no segments are left of less than 400 feet. So it's we want to win 400 feet. That's we don't want to have a good stretch. You know, 6 months later, they fit on the front of the home adjacent. We want those to be done in a manner that allows for continuity of grade and the same quality of installation. Okay, more to come on this. These are high level ideas here.
My assumption is the legislature changed that as because if you have to pour all the sidewalks first and then you move all the heavy equipment to excavate, you're cracking most of inevitable replacement.
Right. And that's part of the complaint that the developer has. They obviously they can bridge, they can put a bunch of dirt over top and protect a sidewalk, but inevitably something's going to get cracked here or there, and they don't want to go back and fix it. But that causes some issues with continuity and when a sidewalk actually gets installed. And what we're concerned about is that a property owner they will end up calling us and saying, "Hey, the developer still hasn't done this. When is this going to be done? Can you pull the bond and do it yourselves?" The city doesn't want to pull a bond. We don't want to be in the business of installing subdivision improvements. That's not our role. We have the ability to do that, but we don't want to. So we want to make sure that the lot owner is protected. They're getting quality installation of infrastructure, and what is handed over to the city is high quality. We don't want to take piecemeal stuff as much as possible. Okay. We'll be more specific as to what this looks like, but we want to get these ideas out there on paper. The developer is required to install all ADA ramps prior to occupancy issued within the subdivision. So the ADA ramps are on the corners of where 2 streets come together. The ADA ramp allows for a wheelchair to come down to street level for those road crossings. Before anybody in the subdivision gets a certificate of occupancy, we want all those ADA ramps installed. Okay. So another point of timeline when that has to be done.
So the legislature is now requiring that.
No, this isn't something I believe is specifically called out in the legislation. This is just something we know. Let's also talk about because the sidewalk, the continuity of the sidewalk comes together at a corner, and we don't want for that corner to be forgotten about. We want that to be integrated in that network of infrastructure.
So there's a number of legislative changes that have been implemented. These
Yes, but these are also certain things that we know we need to adjust even without the legislature releasing changes there. These are ideas that we say, hey, we need to put more detail to this. And we've had some developers push back or say, hey, that's not clear. We want to make sure we make it clear.
If you want to be open to one, the legislature just wants homes going in, and they don't want to have to wait to do subdivision. As fast as those homes can go in, that's the ultimate goal. The problem is that ends up putting the homeowners in the city because the developer will go in as fast as they can to start building homes. And if you don't have access to your home, if you just don't pedestrian wise for sidewalks, you don't have all of your improvements in order for that. After time the developer or through the city, you become a developer. If you don't, and so a lot of these things are just forcing those sympathy to that homeowner to do the sympathy that they have.
I hope as a developer doesn't do that to the lot buyers, but it's been known to happen. So another thing we just want to explicitly state in the code is that it is the developer's responsibility to install those improvements. They can't pass those on to the lot owners. They can't say, well, the lot owner can install the sidewalk when they're ready, or the lot owner can install their street trees or their street light that is adjacent to their lot. They can't pass the buck. So I think that's pretty well understood by most developers that that's not permissible, but we want to just make sure it's in code that, hey, you are the developer, you have bonded for these improvements, the improvement plans as approved show these improvements, it's your responsibility. We need to verify that the code has a minimum of 2 improvement surety options that meet state code requirements. What a surety is essentially the developer, they come in, they say, here's our improvement plans. We'd like to record the subdivision plat and start selling lots. So what happens when you record a subdivision plat, every lot gets a tax ID number, its own legal description, and you can then sell those lots to lot owners. They can do that without having any of the improvements installed, and they can start selling those lots. But before they record the plat, they have to submit a surety to the city that those improvements will be done. So oftentimes they'll submit a bond for 110% of the estimated cost of those improvements. There's different mechanisms: letters of credit, a bond, cash escrow. There's a couple of different options. State code says we have to have at least 2, which our code right now does have 2. One is a bond and one is a cash escrow. We want to go in and verify that those 2 options are meeting the state code requirements for the minimum 2 that are required. We just want to verify that we're doing that. We need to increase the subdivision inspection fee from 2.75% to 3% of the total public improvement costs. We do have an in-house inspector that is inspecting the improvements as they are being installed to make sure they're meeting our standards. And that inspector obviously has a salary and benefits, and there's a cost to the city to provide that service and to make sure the improvements are installed correctly. We did an audit of what other communities are charging, and it's anywhere between 2.5% and 4% of the estimated cost of those improvements. Right now we're at 2.75%. We believe we could get that up a little bit to near the list. We need to clearly indicate that a subdivision access and roadways are required to be installed prior to issuance of a building permit. Which, what we're trying to say here is not for a building permit if you just have roadways now. We're wanting to tie that specifically to the health, safety, and welfare of the citizens. We see a lot of structure fires in the construction, the stick built, contractors have cocaine dealers and whatever else. Arson is a thing too. But we are wanting to say specifically you have to install the road, and by doing so, you've provided adequate fire access capable of supporting 75,000 tons. It's paved, it's not just a pack of road base, it's a all part nature. We want to specifically define that threshold has to be met. Of course, a developer would love to pull building permits without a road economic. We want to put that specifically as a health, safety, welfare issue.
I've seen done where while a subdivision is in construction, they'll do the road base as required, and they'll half
like a veneer on top.
Once all the major equipment's gone, then they'll do the top lift and bring it.
Hmm.
Is that something that we would consider?
We haven't talked about it. I'm
Because
sure.
if they put the finished in and then they gouge it and there's issues, then it's just additional cost.
Yeah, you want to have the most pretty road possible when everything's done being constructed. Yeah, that's something we can talk about. I mean, that comes down to what is best practice. Some communities have probably used that. That's kind of something we want to chat with Public Works on. Engineering, get their opinion to see.
It's a very good point because it wouldn't be possible with our old DSTM because that was 3 inches. You can't really pour 1.5 inches.
Yeah,
Thick. Our new DSTM is 4 inches, so it is a viable option to look at. Sometimes looking at that though, and it's something we can ask contractors. A lot of these we've asked contractors, what is a reasonable effort? What are things that you do? What are other cities doing to go through these same issues that they're looking at, making sure they're not being left high and dry, or residents aren't being left high and dry. The reason that we put 75,000 pounds in there is because that's the minimum requirement for fire code. The only problem is 75,000 pounds with road base meets that standard in the summer. And that's one thing that's often overlooked is in the spring, fall, and winter, 75,000 pounds is not supported by road base. And so it would need something like you just described of a 2-inch lift at least. I'm wondering what the contractor would say, and this is an honest question that we need to ask them because it's a good question to bring up. Is whether it would be cost effective than 2-inch pour and then another 2-inch pour. And the other thing is to ask an engineer about that.
Sure.
You've probably seen 3100 North. You've noticed some issues with that road. We're speculating that it was because it's a 2.5-inch pour and a 2.5-inch pour. That was already alligatoring after 3 years. Very severe issue. Roads are not supposed to do that, and we're looking at that. And the speculation is it's because of the 2 pours, but it is done in other areas. And it's something that we should probably look at. That's a very viable option.
Yeah, I built a home in a neighborhood that did that. It was very rough the first one because of all the equipment that was in and dragging. But it was very
Squishing
nice
rocks.
after they did the final.
It's a very good point.
How long was it that way? Because I'm thinking from the time of the first CO to the last house, being complete. Was it until the last house?
Well, where access to those, they would do it as sections of that. But yeah, it was like that for. It was like that
In
for
my
over-
neighborhood, it was like that.
I was gonna say 2 years. 2 years.
What you could do is just put some stipulations in there during time. You can ask that a lot and see if you put some time stipulations in there, because some substations can sit there for 20 years.
I think you need to do a time.
Yeah, you do a time and a number of lots and access to those lots. Scott's next point.
Yeah, the last one.
You got a timeline. So that could be very viable.
Did you do that in Colorado?
Yeah.
Similar climate. That's it's more of a technical question. I did open to you.
No, it was nice in the winter because it wasn't gullying out, and I know they're done it. I don't know how. I lived there for a long time and didn't see the issue, but it wasn't a 30-month type crap. Residential neighborhood.
Yeah.
On a hill like that. So hopefully we can-
Yeah. So the last thing, again, timeline. When a developer comes in, right now, the city, when we approve their plat, we approve their final plans. If they want to move forward with recording the plat, they have to sign what we call the SET agreement. It's basically the subdivision improvement agreement where they say, here's how much our improvements are going to cost. They estimate their costs and we review their costs to verify that they're adequate. They say we are going to submit a bond, we're going to submit cash escrow or whatever improvement surety that they want to put up. And then they indicate the timeline that they believe that they will be finished with their improvements. And it's kind of open-ended where we say there's a timeline, they put it in, they fill it into the document. And what that does is it then allows us to pull that surety after that timeline. It gives us the right to say we're going to go pull rank and do the improvements ourselves with the money that's been set aside if we don't feel like they're performing or if there's an issue. What we want to do is we want to just say, hey, the standard is a year. after it's approved and you submit your bond and you start working on your improvements, we're saying it's a year before we have the ability to go pull it and do work on our own if we want. We just want to standardize the timeline instead of leaving it open-ended. We feel like a year is reasonable. If they intend to move forward with the project, even if they were to record in the dead of winter, they've got, a good building season to do work. That doesn't mean we have to. We're not obligated to pull the bond and go do the work ourselves. But at that point, we say, okay, guys, we feel like there's issues and we're going to go and do some work ourselves. All of these bullet items, there's a balance, right? The state is pushing for housing affordability and trying to improve the quantity of homes, the deficit. They're trying to chew into that as fast as they can. But there's also a reality that the city has to realize that there's liability if it's done too quick and if it's done sloppily. We don't want to take over infrastructure and perpetuity that's going to have issues. We don't want residents calling us saying, hey, I want to move in. I've got a construction loan that needs to close. I can't get a C of O because the developer hasn't finished the sidewalk or installed whatever. So we're trying to balance these things. We're trying to protect the city's interests and the financial wellness of the community. So these, again, we're going to work on this. We'll inject these ideas into the code adjustments that we're currently working on. But we wanted to instigate the pending legislation so developers know these are topics we are formally discussing and considering. And it allows us to work on that without being beholden to whatever existing language we have.
I'm curious to what level can the city enforce? I'm not going to give the CO as a sidewalk. Where do you start to get into legal issues? Do the state back the city and say this is an allowable?
Yeah, the state code, it specifically states that we can't withhold C of O if the sidewalk is installed.
I know we ran into that issue when I was in my house. The C of O was trying to the city was trying to hold it up because of cracked sidewalk. I get you want a nice sidewalk at the end, but again, building code background. The building is safe to occupy, and it's a cracked sidewalk. It's not a shifted sidewalk, so there's no safety. So I get you want to have a good infrastructure, but I appreciate you saying we got to find that balance. Because,
we got to protect both sides. The city needs leverage to make sure the developers held to the fire, so to speak, to get it done.
Yeah.
When they get it done quickly, that's usually the fastest way to get it done. Yeah. But yeah, it is a balance. The state wants to remove some of the barriers to the speed at which homes are built. We get it. That's admirable, but at the same time, there's real impacts to the municipality that we need to be aware of, and we need to put in specific requirements.
And for what it's worth, I appreciate how something there's no crack. So it was the right thing.
And you don't have to go fight the developer over it, right? Yeah. You don't have to call the city and say, hey, city, this isn't done. It just puts you in that position.
So we get this in the code so the developers can't whine about it. Mm-hmm.
Well, it just sets expectations up front, so it's not negotiable. It is what it is. We may see the legislature further roll back what we are allowed to do, but we'll do what we ever do committed to code.
Sorry, one last thing. Where the subdivision developer is not the same as, say, a builder, these improvements, how does that work in that case? Typically, the developer is going to come in and put in sidewalk and everything, and then they sell the lots to individuals who then go hire their own builder.
Yeah, so the developer, the person who signs that agreement with the timeline, the one that posts the bond or the escrow, they are the developer on the hook to do the improvements. If they sell the lot, if they're not a builder, if they're like Ola Homes, for example, they own a lot for building homes. They're doing both. But custom homes, a lot owner can go hire a custom builder to build the home itself. They are not the ones on the hook to do the subdivision improvements. The actual land developer is, unless they sign it over. So, for example, Sage Hills, Phase 1, south of Smiling H, that developer is looking to sell the project to Sierra Homes, and we are looking at, well, who's going to sign the said agreement? Is it Gordon Mylar, who was the original developer who applied for the subdivision in the first place, or is it Sierra Homes? And we'll look to see who puts up the money for the improvements. It could be both ways, and we could see that happen. But it can't be piecemeal. You can't say, well, this custom home builder is going to build 3 homes, and so they're going to put up a bond for 3% of the 110 estimate. It's not going to do that. It's all or nothing.
In our subdivision, that in the developer grant HOA, so the construction is complete. That capacity to
It's common.
so the developer in that case is involved in the site present anyway. A lot can change between the first house and the last house. So I think that's
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm actually the board president. That's
Yeah. Good experience.
take
Okay,
responsibility. It's good.
Are we ready to move on to
Yeah, this is just work session, so if you guys don't have any more questions, we can move on.
You ready to move on, guys? Okay. Scott, National APA Conference.
And I know,
You took some nice pictures.
yeah. I don't know how much time you guys want to spend on this. I did put it in there just so you can see. I did go and attend this conference. My certification, American Institute of Certified Planners, AICP. This is the organization. I go to conferences to get my continuing education credits. I try to go to a national conference every couple of years, just keep tabs on what's happening nationally. There's also the local APA conferences, Utah APA, the one in the spring that we're going to be part of. That's more localized. This is the national conference, so I did provide you guys with a synopsis of all the notes that I took on the various sessions. Feel free to read through those. Some were interesting, some were boring. As a city planner, it's always interesting to me to go out and explore. And Denver has some cool things that we don't see anywhere else. As a former Coloradoan, I should say that. There's a couple of cool things you guys can go do some research on. The Stapleton Airport is the old airport in Denver before they built the international out east in the Queens. That was a unique opportunity for the city to redevelop into a really cool development, mixed use, but not everywhere. A lot of single family as well. Really cool, very Daybreak-esque. It seems like the best practice when you have a big chunk of land is to master plan it, alley low, with really beautiful frontages and landscaping, pocket parks and those types of things. HOA managed, really cool. Neighborhood guys that we drive through and just observe. The other is the Lowry Air Force Base. It was a big Air Force base through the Cold War, decommissioned, and was a large infill development. It's still infilled, and there's still vacant parcels out there. There's a museum in the center of that neighborhood. 2 old hangars left over from the Air Force Base. There's a B-52 on a pedestal in the middle of the neighborhood. It's kind of fun to see. You're out of the middle of nowhere, you come around the corner, and like, oh, there's a B-52 in the middle of the neighborhood. It was actually interesting as part of the character of the neighborhood. They embraced the fact that it was an old Air Force base, and a lot of the entry signage, and they kind of embraced their heritage, which was kind of cool. So maybe go take a look. I think I actually have a couple of photos of that. Some 3-story townhomes. Something I thought was applicable. This is the old tower at the Air Force Base. If you can kind of look in some of the residential neighborhoods in and around that in the field there.
It has a bit of a barracks look.
It does, yeah. There's the B-52 on a pedestal in the middle of the neighborhood.
Kind of scary.
Yeah. This is an old hangar. So there's 2 hangars. This is an old hangar. This is being converted into multiple office spaces. There's an architecture firm. There's this restaurant with some patio, dining, a bunch of uses in there, old barracks and office buildings. That's kind of sad to see that they used half of that barracks for storage use, but it's just hidden with the units. Makes sense. This is an interesting 3-story single family detached in the middle of 3-story attached. Not that I want. Interesting. Yeah, I won't go through much detail or anything. Feel free to read through some of those notes, and if you see something you're interested in, you can chat about it a little bit more. Golden, home of Coors Beer breweries up there. What I really thought was cool about this, we can't even call it a suburb because it's detached enough from downtown Denver, but some of their entry signage, something we're trying to do with our 2500 North Gateway, probably won't be this thing, but they've really embraced their mining heritage, and also the Coors Brewery. It's part of their identity. They have a lot of history, kind of on their public sidewalks, flags, talking about their heritage, trying to tap into that community identity. Signage was interesting, all coordinated signage. It's an aspiration we have as a city is to coordinate or something. So that's a city sign that's 10 years, somewhere to go. So that was a bigger sign, there's a smaller sign. All coordinated signage. You can see that every single time. They have statues all over the place of some of these other characters. And public art and just the character standpoint, even though entry bridge here is kind of an old industrial mining vibe. Cool trails, more statues, parks. So Golden is also the home of the Colorado School of Mines, and so tapping into that. Any other? Did you guys poke through there? Any questions? Anything you thought was interesting you wanted to discuss?
Did you or did you?
Not in Boulder. No, that was a bit of a drive. But that was a case study in our city center master plan.
I was going to say that's a very good analog, I think, to the city center.
Yeah, and actually, now that you mention it, one of the things I don't think that this is directly applicable to North Logan, but 16th Street, downtown Denver, they've converted this into a pedestrian walking only. They do have buses that still go through here, but it's bus only. But it was interesting that this is a pedestrian only street that they converted from a vehicular to a pedestrian only. There are some lessons to be learned here with our city center, but again, this is downtown Denver, totally different. I think that's it. Unless you guys have anything in particular you want to run through, lessons learned there.
So the spring Utah IPA conference, we saw those minutes in there.
Yeah. Oh, on the agenda. Yeah, let me. Yeah, I can do that for sure. Okay. There's also something that's not on the agenda, but maybe something you're interested in. There's going to be a local land use training in the afternoon on Friday. So the agenda, it's a half day on Friday, and there's likely going to be a training that if planning commissioners want to attend, can go to a planning commissioner, city council member, land use specific training. We're still working on some of those details. I'm waiting to hear back on that. I'll let you know. But yeah, I'll go through this and just say, hey, this is actually going to be interesting. You could take a look at this. And,
So, how we pay for, I'm going to be, I can come to how do we pay?
you don't need to pay for it. I already registered you. So I made sure that I registered the planning commission with the early bird rates. It was, I think it was like $50 or $60, knowing that you guys would likely come to one or two of the sessions here and there. And I feel like it was a very low hanging fruit given that it's local. You don't have to travel, you don't have to pay for hotel rooms or anything else. So I went ahead and registered the planning commissioners, some of the city council members as well. So yeah, you don't need to worry about registration. So you're registered.
And we can just go to whatever we choose to go to.
Yep.
And if we want to do this planning commission training, we'll find out more about
Yeah, I need to get some more information on that. I know that they have that, there's the intent to put that together. We'll see if it comes together. But it would be in the afternoon on Friday.
Okay.
Yep.
Good.
I'll put together some recommendations for you as well.
Good. Okay. Any other business from any of you guys? No? Okay. Next meeting is the special meeting on April 24th. I know a couple of us will not be able to be there. I'm out of town.
Are you going to be out of town as well?
Am too.
I just found out I'll be out of town too.
Okay. You'll be there. We will,
Hold it down for us.
okay, maybe we will plan to record that. Because it's more of like it's like a form-based code 101. It's kind of an education session. So it's not like we're looking for feedback. I mean, we may have feedback given because it's applicable, but the intent is just to introduce the topic to Planning Commission and City Council. I know a couple City Council members. I know Mark's graduation. So we'll see how many can attend in person, but we'll record it. I know that we'll have a presentation we can email out for everybody to review. Okay. We can do that.
Right. I think that we're ready for a meeting to. I'm going to make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded that we adjourn. All in favor?
Aye.